Today, we're going to discuss a topic that I really find interesting. Episode 28: Why Empires Collapse. Human beings do not build futures alone, they build systems, civilization, and empires. And science fiction keep returning to a question history has never fully answered. Why do powerful societies eventually fall? This is the Sci-Fi Griot. I'm your host, Nicholas Cunningham. Over the last several episodes, we explore humanity inside technological futures: identity, memory, community, morality, loneliness, and meaning. But now we begin a new phase because eventually science fiction zooms out beyond individuals, beyond relationships, beyond personal survival, towards civilization themselves, empires, institutions, system of power. And one of the oldest patterns in science fiction is collapse. Not sudden apocalypse necessarily, decay, slow erosion, the gradual weakening of societies that once believed themselves permanent. Science fiction understands something history repeatedly demonstrates. Every civilization believes itself stable until instability becomes undeniable. That's why futuristic empires in science fiction often feel strangely familiar. Massive system, advanced technology, military strength, economic power, and underneath all of it, political exhaustion, widening inequality, moral drift, institutional distrust, bureaucracy, the stagnation, and emotional fragmentation. Science fiction is not obsessed with collapse because it enjoys destruction. It studies collapse because collapse reveals values. What society protect, what they ignore, what they normalize, what they sacrifice to preserve stability. And perhaps the most important thing science fiction understands is this: empires rarely collapse all at once. They often decay internally, long before they fall externally. That's why many science fiction civilizations continue functioning while becoming spiritually hollow. The buildings remain, the system remain, the symbols remain, but trust weakens, meaning weakens, shared sacrifice weakens, and eventually people stop believing the system exists for them at all. Science fiction keep returning to this question: what actually holds civilization together? Is it fear, power, technology, wealth, military control, or is it something deeper? Because many futuristic empires in science fiction collapse not merely because they are attacked, but because they lose moral legitimacy. People stop believing, and once belief erodes, system becomes fragile in ways technology cannot fully repair. That's where we begin this new arch. Why empires collapse? Not simply politically, emotionally, moral, or even spiritually, because science fiction keep reminding us that the greatest threats to civilization often emerge from within. No science fiction series explores civilization collapse more directly than Foundation. The premise, the premise itself is fascinating. Harley seldom develops psychotic history, a mathematical model capable of predicting large-scale social decline. And what does he predict? The collapse of a galactic empire, not because one enemy conquers it, because the empire has become too rigid, too bloated, too disconnected from reality. And that matters Because science fiction repeatedly suggests that powerful systems often mistake longevity for permanence. The galactic empire appears eternal. Its structures are enormous. Its authority reaches across worlds. Its technology is advanced beyond imagination, and yet it is already decaying. Why? Because complexity alone cannot sustain legitimacy. Science fiction understands that civilization require more than infrastructure. They require trust, adapt, adaptability, adaptability, shared purpose, moral imagination, and social cohesion. And once those weaken, collapse become possible even inside technologically advanced systems. Foundation also introduces another important science fiction idea that people inside empires often cannot recognize decline while they're living through it because systems normalize dysfunction gradually. Corruption becomes ordinary, inequality becomes expected, institutional failures become background noise. Science fiction keep warning us about normalization, not because society collapses instantly, because people adapt to decline incrementally. And perhaps that is one reason collapse can feel shocking only after it becomes undeniable. The warning signs exist for years. People simply learn to live with them. Just look at something Star Wars. Star Wars present another classic science fiction question. Why do people support empires in the first place? The empire is oppressive, violent, authoritarian, and yet it emerges partly because people are exhausted. The fear, conflict, political instability, war. Palpatine offers something seductive. Order. That matters enormously. Science fiction repeatedly warns us that civilization become vulnerable when fear makes stability feel more valuable than freedom. People often surrender power gradually when uncertainty becomes overwhelming. And the empire does not present itself initially as evil, it presents itself as necessary. Security, efficiency, control, protection. Science fiction understands something deeply human. Fear changes political imagination. During periods of instability, people often tolerate surveillance, militarization, reduced freedom, and concentrated authority if they believe it will restore order. That's why so many science fiction empires justify themselves morally. They insist the following: the system must become stronger to preserve civilization. But science fiction keep asking, what happens when preserving the system become more important than protecting people? That question appears constantly across the genre, and eventually empires begin treating dissent itself as threats, not because every dissenter is dangerous, because centralized systems increasingly fear instability. That fear creates escalation, more control, more force, more suppression, and over time, fear becomes structural. The empire survived politically by becoming emotionally disconnected from ordinary suffering. That's one of science fiction's oldest warnings. Civilization becomes dangerous when power loses proximity to consequence. Take Dune. Dune explores another terrifying aspect of empire, the myth of the savior. Paul Paul Archites rises within a collapsing imperial system. And what makes Dunn so fascinating is that it refuses simple heroism. Because science fiction often disrupts concentrated power, even when that power appears righteous. Paul becomes leader, prophet, revolutionary symbol, military force, political center, and eventually he realizes something horrifying. People belief in him may unleash violence far beyond his control, and that matters enormously. Science fiction repeatedly warns us that civilization become unstable when entire population place salvation inside individuals rather than system of accountability. Hero worship can become politically dangerous because charismatic power often bypasses institutions, checks and balances, collective responsibility, and moral restraint. And Dune understands another important truth. Empires often sustain themselves through mythology, narrative, prophecy, identity, sacred destiny, not merely military force. Because civilizations survive partly through stories people believe, stories about greatness, exceptionism, destiny, superiority, in inevitability. Science fiction asks what happens when those stories become unquestionable. Often violence becomes easier to justify. Sacrifice become easier to demand, and ordinary people begin absorb into historical movements larger than themselves. Don keep asking us, empires are dangerous not only because of power, but because of belief. Babylon 5 understands institutional decay exceptionally well. The Earth Alliance does not become authoritarian overnight. The change is gradual. Fear increases. Political rhetoric intensifies. Security measures expanded. Dissent, dissent becomes suspicious. And slowly, people inside the system begin compromising. Not always because they are evil, it's because they are afraid or tired or trying to survive. Science fiction repeatedly emphasizes this. Civilization decline often occurs through accumulated compromises, small moral concessions, incremental normalization. People are saying, this is temporary. We have no choice. The threat is too great. The system must be protected. And over time, those temporary measures become structural. And that's why Babylon 5 focused so heavily on resistance, conscious, institutional responsibility, and moral courage inside system. Because science fiction understands that institutions are only as healthy as the people willing to defend ethical boundaries within them. And perhaps the most painful part of decline is that many people recognize it too late. Not because the warning signs were invisible, it's because adaptation is emotionally easier than confrontation. That is one of science fiction's most important political insights. People often normalize dangerous systems slowly, even that resistance feels increasingly costly, until eventually ordinary morality itself begins feeling disruptive. Take the expanse. The expanse shows us another reason civilization destabilized inequality. Earth, Mars, the belt, different population experiencing radically different realities inside the same broader civilization. And that matters because science fiction repeatedly warns us that civilization weakens when shared humanity fragments. When certain population become disposable, invisible, economically trapped, politically voiceless, the belt become emotionally important because the belters experience civilization differently. The system extracts labor, resources, value, but dignity remains unevenly distributed. Science fiction understands this deeply. Empires often sustain prosperity unevenly, and when people stop believing that the system values them equally, social trust erodes. That erosion matters because civilization rely on more than enforcement. They rely on enough people believing that participation still matters. Without that, fragmentation increases, resentment increases, and identity hardens. And eventually, shared civilization becomes difficult to maintain. Science fiction keeps warning us. Extreme inequality is not merely economic instability, it is emotional instability. A civilization divided into radically different lived realities will eventually struggle to remain cohesive. So, after all these stories, what pattern emerges? Empires rarely collapse only because enemies attack them. They often weaken because trust erodes, inequality widens, institutions stagnate, fear replaces vision, bureaucracy replaces moral imagination. People stop believing sacrifice is shared fairly. That last part matters enormously. Civilization becomes fragile when ordinary people no longer believe that the system exists for the common good. Science fiction repeatedly explores moral legitimacy, not simply authority. Authority can enforce compliance temporarily, but legitimacy creates stability. People tolerate sacrifice more willingly when they believe that leaders remain accountable, systems remain fair, suffering is shared, institutions will recognize their humanity. But once those beliefs weakens, empires increasingly rely on force. They rely on propaganda. They rely on surveillance or emotional manipulation or fear of instability. And science fiction keep warning us. System relying primarily on fear often become brittle because fear can suppress resistance temporarily, but it rarely creates durable trust. Now, one of the most fascinating things about science fiction is that it treats civilization emotionally, not merely political. Empires can become exhausted, cynical, paranoid, emotionally fragmented, spiritually hollow. And that matters because societies are not machines, they are networks of people or human beings, which means fear spreads socially, trust spreads socially, despair spreads socially, hope this spreads socially. Science fiction repeatedly suggests that civilizations survive partly through shared emotional investment. People must believe that the future matters, that participation matters, sacrifice matters, community matters. And without that, collapse can begin eternally, long before external structures fail. That's why many science fiction stories focus so heavily on memory, storytelling, identity, collective purpose, moral imagination. It's because civilization need narratives strong enough to sustain social cohesion ethically. And when those narratives collapse, people increasingly retreat toward tribal identity, isolation, survivalism, distrust. Science fiction understands this deeply. The emotional health of society matters as much as their technological sophistication. So, what prevents civilization from collapsing? Science fiction never offers one simple answer, but again and again, it points towards several things: accountability, adaptability, shared sacrifice, moral courage, institutional trust, willingness to confront uncomfortable truths, and preservation of human dignity. And perhaps most importantly, the ability to remain self critical. Science fiction distrusts civilization that believe themselves beyond failures because the illusion of permanence often accelerates decline. Healthy society remain capable of reflection, reform, humility, acknowledging injustice honestly. But without those things, power hardens, and rigid systems eventually struggle to respond when crises emerge. Science fiction keep reminding us empire collapse not only because they become weak, but sometimes they collapse because they become incapable of change. So why do empires collapse? Science fiction answer is layered, not simply because enemies attack them. It's because civilization slowly weakens internally when they lose trust, accountability, shared purpose, moral legitimacy, and emotional cohesion. And perhaps that's why the genre studies collapse so carefully. not to celebrate destruction, but to understand the frailty. Because every civilization imagine itself permanent. And science fiction keep asking, what habits, belief, and system quietly determine whether societies endure or decay? This new phase of the sci-fi griot will continue exploring power, institution, political imagination, and even rebellion, control, ideology, the emotional life of civilization. Because science fiction understands something history keeps proving. The future is not built only through technology. It is built through the moral health of the society using it. And perhaps that brings us to the next question. Is civilization collapse partly through fear, fragmentation, or loss of legitimacy? Then what kind of system do people create when they become obsessed with stability above all else? What happens when order itself becomes sacred? And that's where we're headed next. This has been the Sci Fi Griot, a place to slow down, to reflect, and to remember that civilization survive not only through power, but through the beliefs, relationship, more imagination, and holding people together. My final reflection. What signs would tell you that a civilization was beginning to decay? And would people living inside that system recognize the danger before collapse becomes unavoidable?